Before we begin, please drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Now, let's dive into the story. The crystal chandeliers of the San Francisco gala glittered above us, casting sharp light on the document. Barbara slid the asset waiver across the linen tablecloth. I looked at the crisp pages, then calmly at my husband Julian, who stared at his champagne glass. I did not hesitate. I did not flinch. I just slid the paper back. "I think you have got the wrong person, Barbara," I said softly. "Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community." For 3 years, I had been the charity project of this shipping dynasty. I was 31 years old, running a global logistics firm that I had built from the ground up, but to them, I was just the poor outsider Julian had dragged into their elite circle. Arthur, the 60-year-old tycoon and patriarch, never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. At every corporate dinner, he would introduce me with a dismissive wave, calling my enterprise a cute little delivery service. His daughter, Miranda, a 28-year-old socialite whose greatest achievement was spending her trust fund, would smirk and ask if I was still driving trucks for a living. Why did I stay? Why did I sit at their mahogany tables and absorb their casual cruelty? It is a psychological mechanism known as the trap of cruel normalization. It does not happen overnight. It begins with tiny, almost imperceptible slights. A passive-aggressive comment here, a forgotten invitation there. When you endure these minor infractions to keep the peace, the abusers register that your boundaries are flexible. They establish a new, lower baseline for respect. Eventually, the environment becomes so toxic that emotional abuse is framed as standard family dynamics. They convince you that their cruelty is just high standards, and your discomfort is just you being overly sensitive. You stay because your reality has been warped so gradually that you no longer recognize you are standing in a cage. But they fundamentally misunderstood who I was. I was not trapped. I was gathering data. I did not cry in the bathrooms after Miranda's snide remarks. I did not beg Arthur for his validation. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret for what I was about to do to them, but there was only clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had spent 3 years acting as the silent investor in their version of family, observing their operational inefficiencies and their catastrophic financial hubris. The gala was buzzing around us. Waiters in tailored suits poured vintage wine. Barbara sat at the head of the table, her 58-year-old face pulled tight into a mask of aristocratic superiority. She truly believed that sliding an asset waiver in front of me during a public toast would force my hand. She assumed the social pressure of the San Francisco elite would crush my resolve. It was a calculated business transaction on her part. She wanted to legally sever my logistics company from Julian's inheritance, ensuring I could never lay claim to their legacy. She thought she held all the leverage. She thought she was the apex predator in the room. She was completely wrong. Simon, their 45-year-old lead family counsel, leaned forward. He adjusted his silk tie, an arrogant sneer playing on his lips. He tapped a manicured finger on the asset waiver. He told me my net worth was a rounding error compared to Arthur's portfolio. He ordered me to sign the document, claiming it protected me from the liabilities of real corporate business. I looked at Simon. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my net worth or justify my business. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick black portfolio. I asked him smoothly if he really wanted to talk about real corporate business. For years, I had worn the invisible chains of the survivor. In environments of extreme psychological control, the survivor learns that speaking up only invites more punishment. You learn to mute your reactions, to swallow your pride, to wear a mask of compliance. Society tells you to scream, to fight back immediately. But true survival often requires strategic silence. It is not cowardice. It is tactical patience. You let them think they have broken your spirit, while beneath the surface, you are quietly mapping the exits and quietly acquiring the resources you need. My silence was not submission. It was a camouflage that allowed me to buy up their regional competitors one by one, right under their aristocratic noses. I opened the black portfolio and slid a series of acquisition records across the table. While Simon was advising Arthur on how to shelter assets in offshore accounts, I was acquiring their competition. Simon blinked, his arrogant sneer faltering. I slid the records for Pacific Freight, Zenith Shipping, and Maritime Logistics directly in front of him. Those were the three major supply chain arteries their entire shipping dynasty relied upon to move cargo across the western seaboard. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not need to scream to command the space. The documents did the screaming for me. I told Simon that I realized early on that trying to earn respect in this family was a losing investment. So, I stopped investing in their approval and started investing in their vulnerabilities. The look of utter confusion on his face was worth every single silent dinner I had endured. They were not shocked by what they had done to me. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. This was not revenge. It was accounting. The air at our table turned to ice. Barbara demanded to know what this nonsense was, her voice losing its polished, high society cadence. She ordered Simon to tell me to put those fake papers away, but Simon could not speak. He was staring at the holding company's signatures, tracing the legal architecture I had spent 36 months building. I looked directly at Arthur, the great shipping tycoon. I asked him, my tone as level as a metronome, who held the primary operating lease for his Pacific fleet. Arthur scoffed, though his hands were beginning to tremble against the edge of the tablecloth. He snapped that it was Omnicorp Holdings, a multinational entity I could never comprehend. I told him I comprehended it perfectly. I instructed him to take out his phone and search the corporate registry for Omnicorp Holdings. I told him to look up the executive board. The entire table went completely still. Even Miranda stopped scrolling on her phone, her perfectly contoured face registering the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Arthur glared at me, refusing to move. But Simon, whose job was to protect the family from risk, pulled out his device. His fingers flew across the screen, accessing the firm's secure internal financial dashboard and their latest private corporate disclosures. I watched the exact second the $4.2 billion truth registered in Simon's brain. The color drained from his face entirely. He looked from his phone to me, his eyes wide with a terror that money could not buy. His voice cracked as he whispered to Arthur that I was the chief executive officer. I was the primary shareholder of Omnicorp. Barbara's face went chalk white. Her foundation of elitism cracked down the middle. Arthur snatched the phone from Simon's hand, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. His hands shook violently now, rattling the crystal glasses on the table. The illusion was breaking. The gala continued around us, but the focus at our table had shifted entirely to me. Julian, my husband, finally looked up from his glass. He had remained passive for 3 years, a silent bystander to his family's cruelty. Now, he stared at me, not with the love of a husband, but with the hollow, terrifying realization that he had profoundly underestimated the woman he slept beside for 3 years. Now, he stared at me as if he were looking at a stranger. I felt no pity for him. My affection had been a contract, and he had failed to uphold his end of the mutual defense clause. Arthur stammered, his booming voice reduced to a dry rasp. He asked if I owned the leases, if I owned the operational infrastructure of his fleet. I told him I owned the ships, the ports, and the routes he needed to fulfill his international contracts. I simply nodded. I told him I owned the ships, the ports, and the routes he needed to fulfill his international contract. But I was not finished. Owning their supply chain was just the operational takeover. The financial execution was still pending. I reached into my portfolio again and pulled out a second, thinner red folder. I told Arthur that it got worse, sliding the red folder directly in front of him. He hesitated, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. With shaking fingers, he opened the cover. Inside were the audited financial statements of their family trust, alongside the corporate debt ledgers of their shipping empire. I told them they had been parading around San Francisco as a $4 billion dynasty. But their family trust was a ghost town. For the past 5 years, they had been securing massive operational loans to cover their failing legacy contracts. They had leveraged the family trust as collateral. Simon started to hyperventilate. He knew exactly what was in those ledgers. He had likely drafted the fraudulent leverage agreements himself. I addressed the frozen faces around the table. I explained that when you secure illegal corporate loans using a private family trust, you need a shadow creditor willing to look the other way. They had used a private equity firm in Geneva. I hadn't just bought the debt. I had become the primary entity holding their restructuring mandates, giving me full legal oversight of their fiscal operations. Barbara looked at Simon, desperation leaking from her eyes. She begged Simon to do something, to tell me this was illegal, but Simon was paralyzed. I revealed calmly that I had been systematically acquiring their corporate debt from that Geneva firm over the past 3 years, piece by piece, as they struggled to meet their own loan covenants. The criminal twist was fully exposed. They had committed systemic financial fraud, over-leveraging private trusts to fund commercial operations, and I had quietly acquired all the receipts. I was no longer just their landlord. I was their sole creditor. The legal consequences for their past financial maneuvering were beginning to surface in real time. Securities fraud, embezzlement, criminal negligence. Simon realized immediately that his fingerprints were all over the fraudulent filing. He began to back away from the table, looking for an exit. I sat perfectly still, watching their empire burn down to the foundation. The total collapse of their reality happened in slow motion. Barbara, the terrifying matriarch who had slid the asset waiver to me just 10 minutes earlier, broke completely. The polished facade melted away, leaving a desperate, terrified woman. She begged for mercy, her voice cracking as tears ruined her expensive makeup. She promised we could make a deal, offering me board seats and pleading with me not to take the house. Arthur tried one last pathetic attempt to pull rank. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. He bellowed his own name, attempting to summon the ghosts of his legacy. He called me a petty truck dispatcher and threatened to have me destroyed in court. I watched his meltdown with clinical detachment. Why do the ultra-wealthy shatter so completely when the money disappears? It is the illusion of power of an empty wallet. For legacy families, their entire identity, their psychological safety, and their social dominance are rented properties paid for by their net worth. They do not possess internal resilience because they have never needed it. They confuse having resources with having character. When the bank accounts are frozen, the illusion dissolves. Without their money, they are not titans. They are just fragile, terrified people who have no intrinsic value to fall back on. They cannot survive the wilderness because they have only ever lived in a zoo. Before Arthur could finish his empty threats, the heavy oak doors of the gala hall swung open. 3 federal agents in tailored suits walked directly toward our table. The venue's security did not intervene. The evidence I had provided was too damaging to ignore. They were not there for Arthur. They were there for Simon. I had forwarded the fraudulent trust ledgers to the authorities 3 days ago. The officers announced they had a warrant for Simon's arrest regarding corporate securities fraud. The police handcuffed the family lawyer right in front of the horrified elite of San Francisco. The facade broke entirely. Surrounding guests pulled out their phones, recording the spectacular, unmitigated downfall of the family who had built a $4 billion empire on lies. Barbara sobbed openly. Arthur collapsed back into his chair. Miranda hid her face. I picked up my black portfolio and walked away. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and stepped into the cool, sharp air of the San Francisco night. The valet offered to bring my car around, but I politely waved him off. I wanted to walk. I needed to feel the solid concrete beneath my feet, to anchor myself in the absolute reality of what I had just accomplished. Behind me, high up in the glowing penthouse, a century-old empire was being dismantled piece by piece, ledger by ledger. The streets were quiet, a stark, peaceful contrast to the chaotic implosion I had left behind in the gala. As I walked down the avenue, I felt a profound structural lightness settling into my shoulders. For 3 long years, I had allowed my self-worth to be measured by a yardstick created by people who possessed no actual moral or intellectual value. I had sat at their mahogany tables, silently absorbing their condescension, holding my breath, and waiting for a validation that was never going to come. I had mistakenly believed that if I just proved my business acumen, if I just showed them I was worthy of respect, they would eventually grant me a legitimate seat at their table. But that is the ultimate devastating trap of seeking approval from toxic, elitist environments. You exhaust your mental and emotional energy trying to earn a seat at a table that is fundamentally rotten to its core. You compromise your own dignity to appease people who view your mere existence as an existential threat to their unearned superiority. I did not need a seat at their table. I needed to reclaim my own, and I needed to own the building it sat in. This victory was not truly about the $4.2 billion in leveraged debt. It was not about acquiring the cargo ships, the international ports, or the global supply chain infrastructure. It was about absolute autonomy. It was about the unshakable realization that I am the sole architect of my life. I had built a logistics empire from the ground up using grit, data, and relentless determination. I did not need to be married to a legacy family name to validate my success in the corporate world. I was my own legacy. I thought about Julian, Barbara, Arthur, and Miranda. They would spend the next decade tangled in federal financial investigations, grueling bankruptcy hearings, and the brutal, unforgiving reality of public disgrace. Their shallow social circle would abandon them the exact moment the corporate credit lines froze. They would learn the hard and painful way how incredibly cold the world is when you cannot buy your way out of the consequences of your own actions. But their impending misery was no longer my concern. My emotional ledger was completely balanced. I held no hatred for them anymore, only the clinical, sterile detachment of a finalized audit. I leaned back against the leather seat of the cab I hailed, watching the glittering skyline of the bay reflect in the window. Tomorrow, the financial press would release the news of the acquisition. Tomorrow, the shipping industry would wake up to a completely reshaped hierarchy. But tonight was just for me. The silence in the back of the car was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 3 years. No snide remarks, no gaslighting, no more pretending to be small so others could feel big. I've come to realize that true power is never loud. It does not need to scream, demand attention, or belittle others to prove its existence. True power is the quiet, unwavering confidence of knowing exactly who you are and knowing exactly what you are capable of building from scratch. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the prison of their expectation. I forgive them for their arrogance, not because they deserve my grace, but because I refuse to carry the heavy weight of their toxicity into my pristine future. I am stepping entirely out of their shadow and stepping into the empire I built with my own 2 hands. If this story gave you the strength to stand up for yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys to justice.